Welcome to Story Time with Chris James, and I will pick up right where I left off last time. The last man, following a few steps behind, was wearing a straw hat. He had overalls and work boots. The smell of a cow was kind of strong. Pam thought she recognized him. That's Sam Cassavetes, the guy I'm looking for that started this whole episode. Pam jumped up and ran after the missing, now found farmer. Rancher? Cowman. She caught up with Sam in no time and tried to get him to stop. Grabbing the strap of his overalls, she pulled. Sam just kind of spun halfway around, dropping his box of spices. Some of the jars broke open, filling the air with a bizarre mixture of sweet, sour, pungent, and peppery smells. His eyes passed over Pam like she wasn't there. Turning back to the group, he began following, now relieved of his cargo. Pam could only watch her quarry walk away into the distance. Well, at least you know he's still alive and on Earth, Sarah said. They began walking the way they had been heading for way too long. There was light up ahead, lots of light, enough to see there was a ramp going up into the ceiling. The two stopped and listened for any movement above. It's quiet. Let's move up, but be ready to run if we have to. Pam began to slowly walk up the ramp. Sarah was right next to her, being sure to stay closer to the wall. The ramp went up in a spiral, allowing them an easy pace. The only sound was what they made themselves. They went around and around, always upwards. Pam began to feel it in her thighs. Even with all the running she'd done over the past 8 months, she was not ready for this workout. She looked at Sarah. Let me know if you need a break. She paused as Sarah slumped to the floor. I'm going to hate being a paranormal investigator. This walking and running and walking is icky. Sarah didn't want to act like a little girl, but she wasn't feeling like a big girl right now. Just leave me here. Send down some food and water and a book to read if you get a chance. Maybe a pillow and a blanket. Pam considered leaving Sarah, only for about a half a second, but it was tempting. As sore as her thighs and legs were, she could only guess what her minion was feeling. She was thinking about how she could get Sarah back on her feet when the solution was handed to her. Someone is coming. We gotta go. Pam had heard footsteps coming from below. Sarah tried to jump to her feet, only to wind up on her hands and knees. She began crawling up the ramp. Pam reached down and lifted her to her feet. With one hand up under her arm and the other around her waist, Pam began to half carry, half drag her companion up the ramp. Just a little farther. Pam said, just a little farther, maybe 10 times before her head popped up into the light. She looked around fast and then hauled Sarah up and into a huge room. The roof was curved, looking like a half of a giant pipe. Dozens of metal light fixtures hung from above. Some were still working. There were several golf carts parked next to the ramp. Boxes were scattered just about everywhere. Most were empty, but many still held cheese or spice. The closer they got to the far wall, the higher the boxes were stacked or piled. Pam tried to lower Sarah to the floor, only dropping her a little ways. She pushed a bunch of boxes away from the wall and drug her partner into the hollowed out space. Pam crouched down next to Sarah and waited. Peeping up over her fortress of cardboard, Pam watched as people came shuffling up the ramp. They all had that far away look. Once in the gigantic room, they all just stood around waiting for somebody to tell them what to do. A door banged open somewhere, and an MIB came walking from the shadows. Pam thought he might be a different being than the two she'd seen down below. It was hard to tell. They all looked the same. This one looked at the assembled humans and then walked over to an electric box mounted on the wall. He pushed a button, or maybe he flipped a switch. A loud rumbling sound filled the air. One wall began to open. As the wall moved, Pam saw an airplane was sitting right outside. "This must be a hangar," she whispered so Sarah would know where they were, if she was even awake. Pam got her cell phone out and began to text Dolores. Dolores was snoring, laying in the back of the hearse. Manuel thought he heard her phone making sounds, something like thunder and wind. "Dolores! Hey, Dolores!" He looked over at Naomi. "Can you reach back there and grab her cell phone?" Once Naomi had been rescued from Mr. Thresher, the folks at the bag company had taken turns bringing her up to speed on all the new things available. Cell phones had been around since the 1990s. It hadn't been the kind of thing psychics were looking to use. Naomi reached back and tried to get Dolores's phone, only to find she had it held tight in her hands. She was waiting for an important text message from Pam and sleeping through it once it had come. "Forget it. Send Pam a text and ask her where they are." Naomi dug her cell phone out and then noticed she had a text from Madame Dingus. Opening it, she read, "Nothing new here. Store looks the same. Have you found Pam and Sarah yet? Let us know what's going on." Naomi began to answer the text, and then she thought maybe she should get with Pam to find out if the two needed anything, like medical attention or the army. She asked Pam for an update. "They're at the airport, inside Hangar 18. There's an all-white C-130 loading boxes of cheese and spices. Let everybody know to head to the airport." Manuel gave it just a bit more gas and aimed for the other side of town. Pam was alternating her attention between her cell phone and what was going on at the far end of the hangar. A bunch of people dressed like soldiers were unloading huge pallets full of boxes. Each pallet was almost as big as her truck. The soldiers were all doing their best to ignore the zombies, who were not having any difficulty ignoring everything. Pam crouched down next to Sarah. As she moved just a little, her toe moved a box. The box tipped just enough to release a small cloud of powdered cayenne pepper. They both suddenly felt an urge to sneeze. Sarah tried squeezing her nose shut. Pam had both hands over hers. The cayenne pepper was burning the insides of her nose. They both let go at the same time. The sound seemed to travel the length and width of the hangar in record time. The MIBs looked over at where Pam and Sarah were both still sneezing. He held his thumb up to his ear and began talking into his pinky. The door that had banged open earlier banged open again, followed by the sound of many shoes on concrete. Pam saw a dozen MIBs all coming for them. Run! She pulled Sarah to her feet and made for the far end of the hangar. The MIBs didn't bother running. They knew the doors were all secured at the end of the building. Pam's legs began to hurt as soon as she'd gone several yards. Sarah was only staying on her feet because Pam had her by the arm and by the belt. Out of the gloom, an obstacle loomed. The two were right on top of it before Pam could figure out what it was. Another golf cart. Without slowing down, she dragged Sarah onto the front seat and stomped on the it's not a gas pedal. The cart doesn't use gas. It's electric. She pushed down on the go thingy on the floor. The cart jumped forward, throwing her onto the seat. The cart spun around in a tight circle, scattering boxes in all directions. The MIBs all did their best to get out of their way. Pam felt the car bounce as it went over somebody's foot. She managed to get the cart going in a straight line. She aimed for the hangar doors on the far end of the building. Pam could see they were already closing. She tried pushing down harder on the go thingy, but the cart didn't seem to move any faster. "We're not going to make it," she yelled to Sarah just for something to do. The doors were almost closed and they still had almost half of the floor ahead of them. As the opening to the ramp came into view, Pam turned to the wheel and sent the cart, as well as its two occupants, back down into the subterranean tunnel. The cart shot down the ramp, being helped by gravity. Sarah thought could hear the wheels squealing. She looked back over her shoulder. They don't seem to be following. They kind of have us trapped between here and the grocery store. What do we do?" Sarah was still looking back, just in case. "There are several dozen MIBs behind us. I only saw 3 at Merkel's. Let's keep going." She tried giving it more electricity, but the cart was already at its max speed. Uh-oh, they're coming. Sarah could see lights following behind. "Are they gaining on us?" "No, it looks like we're going at about the same speed." Pam wanted to look back for some unknown reason. She thought it over and decided to let Sarah do the looking back while she did her best to avoid the boxes and spilled spices and cheese littering the tunnel ahead. It would help if this thing had. She pulled on a knob and one headlight came on. Well, that's better than nothing. She could now see where they were going. Mr. Armstrong was the first vehicle to the airport. Manuel was not far behind him. After a few minutes, Madame Dingus came driving in as well. "Look for an all-white C-130," Manuel yelled to everyone. Bill Palmerhausen quickly flipped through his Rolodex. "Over there on the north end of the runway." He had a few airplane photos for those occasions when things got weird, like this one. Susie had put an image of just about everything on the planet, well, as long as it might go missing, in one of the hundreds of Rolodexes in his office. Mr. Armstrong hit the gas and took off out across the runway. Manuel thought about a dozens of rules being violated, and then he followed. Madame Dingus figured they can't arrest all of us, and she was right on their heels. The airport police saw a woodland camouflaged Ridgeline pickup being chased by an old-style hearse followed by an old Delta 88. Madame Dingus had driven a Mercedes until being eaten by that giant onion. Strange things had happened, and now she no longer cared what others thought of her or her mode of transport. They turned on their overheads and tried to catch up with the parade. Mr. Armstrong did a power slide into a space between the C-130 and the hangar. Hortense jumped out from the passenger seat only to be reeled back in by the seatbelt. Manuel parked the company car well out of the way, not wanting it to be damaged by any flying things coming from around Mr. Armstrong. Naomi sent a quick text telling Pam the cavalry has arrived. Dolores was still asleep in the back. Pam felt her cell phone vibrating. She knew it was a bad idea to text while driving. She was going to ask Sarah to get it, but didn't want to lose track of the MIBs that were following. Pam knew the second they took their eyes off of those fiends, they would magically catch up with them. She pulled her cell phone out and had a quick look. Oh, great. Everybody is now at the airport. She got busy sending a text while trying to keep an eye on the tunnel ahead. Pam and Sarah are handbagging bags to Merkel's. Naomi looked at what she had just read. Yep, that's what it says. She held her phone up in case anybody wanted a look. Oh, wait, they're holding bugs at Marky's. Naomi began to suspect this modern technology wasn't all it was bragged up to be. The airport police came skidding to a halt, blocking any escape. Pam could see stoves ahead. Lots of stoves. They were coming to the end of the tunnel. She began looking for any sign of the MIB that were still there. The guys chasing us are getting closer. Sarah was kneeling on the seat, looking back. As soon as I stop, let's jump out and run for it. Stoves began to whiz by on both sides of the cart. The airport police had called for backup as soon as they saw the vehicles crossing the runway. They did their best to look intimidating while not getting too close. Nobody move! Hands in the air. How do we put our hands in the air without moving? This was from Hortense. One of the airport police spotted Mr. Armstrong. Uh, is this one of those weird things we don't want to get involved with? Mr. Armstrong had all the Army guys laid out on the tarmac. He hadn't even really threatened anyone yet. Something in his eyes as he thought about finding Pam made the soldiers all feel like getting on the ground and not moving. Madame Dingus looked at the officers. Andrew, is that you? How's your mother? I haven't seen her in months. The officer quickly lowered his pistol, not wanting his mother to hear that he'd pointed it at one of her friends. Uh, she's good. He looked at all the other officers. Hey, knock it off. You want to get me in trouble with my mom? They all lowered their sidearms. Mr. Armstrong hadn't even looked up. His attention was directed at the guy with the officer thingies on his uniform. Let's try this again. Why are you flying cheese and spice into this airport? Captain Obvious didn't need this in his life. Orders! You know, pick up a load here, you take it there. He was scared of the guy with all the guns. He was terrified of that huge woman in black with death in her eyes. The old lady didn't look too friendly either. Hortense was afraid something bad was happening to Pam right this very minute, and this guy in the green jumpsuit might be responsible. It was all she could do to not yank him off his feet, which would have been quite a trick, seeing as he was laying on the ground. Mr. Armstrong leaned in close. Who's giving the orders? I don't know. We get orders, and we follow them. The captain was beginning to wish he had been just a PFC. All the others were more than happy the huge guy was ignoring them. The giant in black was something they definitely wanted to avoid. Pam figured it was time to stop. The wall was coming up quick. She took her foot off the go thingy and tried to mash on the stop thingy. There is no brake pedal on this golf cart. As soon as her foot was no longer pushing on the power bar, the cart began to slow down. Unfortunately, it took a few feet more to stop than what was between it and the wall. The cart crashed into the wall right next to the door. The wall was not all that well made, seeing as the builder MIBs didn't really actually know how to build anything, and they had saved some time by not bothering with too many studs. The cart went through the wall, sending the three MIBs hiding on the other side, waiting for the two girls, flying into the other side of the hallway. Pam was able to use the steering wheel to keep from being pitched across the front of the cart. Sarah had no such handhold. As she went flying over the front of the cart, leading with her backside. One of the MIBs was raising his weapon when he was hit by a flying tween. The air was knocked from his lungs as Sarah bounced off his chest. She landed on the floor, now holding the weapon the MIB had just lost. It looked like somebody had made a pistol using Legos, wrapping the entire thing in tinfoil and then spray painting it gray. Freeze! Hands in the air! She aimed the thing at the three MIBs. Well, which is it? Do we freeze or do we raise? Oh, never mind. They all raised their hands in the air. From some unknown reason, this made Sarah more nervous. She stepped back a few paces. Pam didn't like the way the MIB was smiling at Sarah, as if he somehow had the upper hand. She jumped from the golf cart and went to back up her minion. Everything happened in slow motion. The MIB to the right of the nasty-looking MIB brought his hands down suddenly, holding a second weapon. He aimed right at Sarah. The golf cart jumped forward, slamming into all three MIBs. Pam was wondering why it moved when she heard the crashing sound of a second golf cart slamming into the cart that they had been using. The second cart was hit by a third, which was slammed into by a fourth, on and on. The MIBs that had been in hot pursuit were now scattered about the floor of the hallway and the room full of cooking equipment. Pam and Sarah had been standing just far enough to the side to avoid being hit by any of the fast moving, suddenly stopping carts or beings. Pam looked at what amounted to 18 or 20 MIBs all sprawled out on the floor. They all began to get to their feet. Run! Pam pushed Sarah to the right and began to run. Sarah did more staggering than running, being held up and drug along by her companion. The two did their best to reach the end of the hallway before being shot at or shot by the MIBs. Something flew past Pam's head. It was followed by a second and then third unknown object. They made a zinging sound as they went. The wall at the end of the hall exploded 3 times. Knowing this was probably a bad thing, Pam grabbed a doorknob and tried to open the door to her right. She hung on tight as her body kept going until reaching the end of her arm. Her other arm was pulled as Sarah came to a halt as well. Pam felt as if her reach was now maybe 20% longer. The door swung open and she dashed through, dragging Sarah along the floor behind her. You still have that weapon? In response, Sarah reached out into the hallway and fired back the way they'd come, keeping her head inside the room and out of the line of fire. Ceiling tiles and floor tiles exploded all up and down the hall, halfway between them and the MIBs. The unexpected return fire did cause the MIBs to all seek cover inside of perusing their all seek cover instead of perusing their quarry. Mr. Armstrong had finished castigating the soldiers for following orders that were clearly wrong. He was now looking for a means of getting inside the hangar and rescuing Pam and Sarah. There was no means of opening the huge door, so the bag team had broken up to look for a way in. Hortense's voice came from his radio. "There's a door that's now open on the north side of the hangar. Over." "On my way." For such a big man, Mr. Armstrong was fast on his feet. He rounded the corner and saw a side door had been completely smashed in by a rather large, very mad woman. The rest of the bag team was running to the door as well. Inside, they found hundreds of people standing around waiting for someone to tell them what to do. "Oh, y'all, over against that wall and sit." Mr. Armstrong's voice filled the hangar. The assembled zombie people shuffled over to the far wall. Most of them managed to sit down, while others more like fell over. A few leaned against the wall and just stayed that way. "Pam! Sarah! Where are you?" Hortense hollered. Bill pointed one finger. "They're behind those boxes." He ran over to be the first to rescue the two missing girls. The others were right behind him. They pushed and kicked boxes out of their way until one of them found a set of keys. "Oh, shoot." The team spread out looking for their missing friends. As they searched, Madame Dingus looked at the ramp going down into the floor. "Maybe they're down there." Everybody gathered around the opening. "We could send a search team down there in that." Madame Dingus pointed to a golf cart parked over by the wall with a few hundred zombie people sitting or laying around it. "I'll go." Bill was still aching to be the one to save Pam and that other girl. "I should go, being the senior bag member." This came from Naomi. Even though she'd only actually worked at the bag office for about 11 years, but combined with the time while in suspended animation, she had over 30 hours as a bag member. Seeing as she was 38, time in suspended animation didn't count. Well, this is kind of hard to explain. "I think this situation calls for weapons. Lots of weapons," Mr. Armstrong said. A not too heated argument ensued. The golf cart sped through the darkness. The way ahead was lit by the headlights that were aimed way too high to show any obstacles laying on the floor. The cart had 7 people squeezed into one seat and the space in the rear where the clubs went. With the back bumper almost touching the ground, the front headlights were pointed at nothing of any use. Mr. Armstrong was driving, since nobody was brave enough to tell him no. Madame Dingus was in the middle of the seat, with Dolores next to her, hanging halfway out the door. Manuel, Naomi, Medusa, and Bill were standing in the back, hanging on to whatever they could, trying to not get bounced off as the cart went over everything not seen by the driver. Pam looked around to see what kind of a situation they were in now. Stairs. There was a stairwell with steps going in both directions. These looked like old, expanded metal industrial workings, something the military would have done years ago, before either of Pam's parents had been born. At one time there had been paint, now the metal was a uniform rust color. The handrail was covered in dust. "What do you think? Up or down?" She could see a light up on the next landing, a very dim light. Sarah found the weird weapon had stopped working after she had pulled the trigger a few dozen times. It didn't make a clicking sound, it just stopped sending out those tiny explosions. The stairs going down looked inviting since gravity would be on their side. There was no telling what might be down there or how deep they might go. Maybe we should go up? Sarah made this sound more like a question. Up it is. Pam didn't much care for climbing anything, but she didn't want to go out of this. She did want to get out of this underground complex filled with hostile MIBs. How far down underground are we again? Like 10 or 100 floors or so, probably more, thousands of feet down. Sarah felt like her legs were already giving up. Pam needed a rest. Her legs had been tired before they'd even begun. Sarah lay down on the landing, face down. Just leave me here. Send down some food if you get a chance, she mumbled into her arm. Pam looked around the landing. They had passed several, maybe 6 or 8. None had a door or any way of getting in or out. Some didn't even have a light. She let Sarah rest as long as she thought possible and then said, "Listen, someone's coming. We'd better get going." Sarah got her hands and her knees under her body, and then she began crawling towards the steps. "Come on, get up. We have to go." Pam grabbed Sarah by the belt and lifted. Sarah didn't weigh very much, but Pam was exhausted. "Go, let's go." Pam half carried, half drugged Sarah up to the next landing, then the one after that. As each landing came and went, Sarah tried to pull away to rest. "No, no, no, not here. Rest when we get to the surface." Up they went. The cart filled with a well over capacity of bag members passed a bunch of stoves. "That's odd," Dolores voiced what everybody was thinking. Medusa was standing with her head well over the top of the cart. This gave her the advantage of being able to see a long ways ahead. "There's something up ahead." She strained to make out what it was in the dim light from above. "Stop! It looks like a roadblock or something." Mr. Armstrong looked for some place to turn and get out of the line of any hostile fire. The stoves made this impossible. He drew a handgun and held it out of the cart as it came to a stop. It stopped when it slammed into the pileup. No one began shooting, so he lowered his weapon. The way ahead was filled with golf carts, some kind of piled one on top of another. They filled the opening ahead. Everyone jumped from the cart and looked around for anybody either on their side or not. "There's a door right next to the pileup." Manuel hoped one of the others would volunteer to open it and see what was on the other side. Medusa reached the door before Mr. Armstrong and kicked it open. Actually, she kicked it right off its hinges. The door flew across the hall and hit the other side. She stuck her head through the opening and looked in both directions. "It's empty. What do we do now?" Pam rounded the next turn in the stores and found the stairs, not stores. Pam rounded the next turn in the stairs and found a blank wall. What kind of person builds a staircase going nowhere? She tried to ease Sarah to the floor, only dropping her a few feet. Sarah lay there in a heap. Mumble, 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 mumble. It sounded dire. Not to be deterred, Pam walked back and forth, examining the wall in front of her. She ran her hands over it. Nothing. She tried hitting it. Ow! Now her hand hurt. Sarah went mumble, 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 mumble. still laying face down, talking into her sleeve. Pam rolled Sarah over. "What was that? You were mumbling." Without opening her eyes, Sarah said, "I thought you said there were MIBs coming and we had to go." That's not quite what I said. It was more like someone is coming. Hey, it got you moving." Sarah looked around without getting up from the floor. "Where are we? Where's the door? How do we get out of here?" She closed her eyes and then reopened them to see if a door had magically appeared. Pam looked around some more. The stairs just stopped after taking them up what felt like 100 feet. No one, I don't care if they're from another planet, would build a staircase to nowhere. One of those ideas popped into her head. Not the bad ones, where she wound up being chased by unseen monsters or getting married to some dead guy. An actual, possibly good idea. "Sarah, you still have that alien wand?" "That's what's digging into my backside." She rolled to one side and pulled the wand from her back pocket. "Do you think? See if you can get us out of here." Sarah grasped the wand and held it over her head. "Wait, you should be standing up first." "Why? I'm too tired." "Because. Because. You should be standing upright before using alien technology in case you wind up somewhere that you need to run from." Pam managed to pull a very grumpy, uncooperative tween to her feet. "Okay, now do your thing." Sarah held the wand in the air over her head. Nothing happened. She looked at it and then tried shaking it a bit. The landing around them suddenly moved. The two stood there about to ask each other questions with no answers when they stopped. The wall in front of them slid open like a door. Mr. Armstrong looked up and down the hallway. "We'd better split up and check in both directions. Pam and Sarah might be in any one of these rooms." Everybody wanted to go with him since he was the biggest one of them and he had the most firepower. Hortense was taller, but Mr. Armstrong was far more massive. And he had lots of weapons. Hortense only had her grandfather's Army issue 45 1911 with a 7-round magazine. She never bothered to carry extra magazines since she never really had to shoot at anyone before. She wasn't even all that sure if the thing was loaded. "Look, half of you need to go that way." Mr. Armstrong pointed down the hall. "We'll go this way and check each door." Everyone still tried to stand on his side of the hallway. "Hortense, take Naomi, Dolores, and Bill and check in that direction." He glared at them to make his point. "Holler if you find Pam or Sarah. Hopefully they're still together." He led Madame Dingus and Manuel on their search. The doors were kind of far apart. Hortense stopped at the first door and opened it. She could feel Dolores, Naomi, and Bill standing right behind her. The room was filled with kitchen gadgets. Lots of kitchen gadgets. It looked like a room full of all the things you'd see being advertised late at night by some way too happy salesman. "But wait, there's more," kind of things. "Pam, Sarah, you in here?" she yelled, but not too loud as to be heard more than a few feet away. "Do we need to search each and every room as we go?" Naomi kind of felt an obligation to find Pam since she had been instrumental in saving her from Mr. Thresher. "Let's just check each room first. We'll come back and do a thorough search if we don't find them first." Hortense hoped this was a good plan. The next room they found was filled with racks all holding clothing. Medusa looked at one of the garments. It was a black suit. There were dozens, no, hundreds of black suits all hanging on racks. The next aisle over had white shirts, all nicely starched and ready for somebody to come put one on. Hats and shoes were sitting on shelves along one wall. This looks like an MIB store or a dressing room or something. She walked back out to the hall. Naomi opened a door. Look, stairs. This might be a fire exit. Do you think they might lead out? Hortense looked down and then up. Looks like somebody has been here recently. She tried to see if she could detect any sign it was Pam or Sarah, or better, both. The last folks went up. Manuel volunteered to slip up the stairs and see where they went and who was up there. He was making good time for the first dozen landings. By the time he was most of the way up, he wished he'd kept his mouth shut. At long last, the final landing came into view. Oh, this is just stupid. He looked at the solid cement wall. Pam stuck her head out and looked around. The room was pitch black. She felt all of her pockets just in case she had brought a flashlight along without realizing it. Once she had checked every pocket twice, she thought about her cell phone. After poking a few buttons, the light came on. They were looking at another hallway. Only this one looked fancy and elegant. Looking back and forth, Pam had a feeling she'd been here before. A few feet to their left was a metal detector, the big kind that cost a lot of money and are usually found in government buildings, places like City Hall. I was here with Belle just a few months ago. They were standing in the lobby of City Hall late on a Sunday night. None of the deputies were there working security. Come on, we need to get out of here and find the others. Pam looked at Sarah, who was once more laying on the floor. She was trying to play dead, like a possum, only minus the tail and fur. Over by the metal detector was a basket used to haul the mail in. Pam grabbed it and wheeled it over to where Sarah was still refusing to move. Get in, and I'll push you. Can't move. My body's broken. Oh, come on. It's not that bad. Pam bent down to lift her minion. Her back hurt. Her legs hurt. If she felt this bad, Sarah must be in need of the strong drugs and a vacation. Grabbing Sarah by the collar and the belt, she managed to get her up and into the basket. Hold tight. Pam started towards the door. I hope they're not locked. She pushed, and the door popped open. No alarm went off, and nobody came running to see who was trying to break in, or rather out, of City Hall. Officer Nancy Hildenpfeffer looked at her watch. Only an hour left in her shift. Then it was home to her quiet apartment. No drunks to argue with, no taxpayers to tell her that they paid her salary. Sometimes she thought it was too quiet at home. Maybe she should put in for some overtime. She was taking a slow roll through the downtown area before heading to the office. Up ahead was some kind of a bag lady pushing a cart. I'll bet she stole that cart from Merkel's. I'd better check her out. She pulled to the curb and hit the overheads. Looking closer at the woman, Nancy saw there was a body laying in the cart. This is getting interesting. Pam saw the flashing red and blue lights flashing all around her. She turned to see who was pulling her over. Sort of. You! Nancy recognized that weird kid from that bunch of weirdos that hung out in that old mansion. PD doesn't do paranormal. She looked at Sarah, who had managed to lift her head enough to show that she wasn't dead. "Take your cohort and get out of my city." Pam couldn't help feel just a bit responsible for the officer's dislike of her and the bag company. Every time they met, something really bad happened, usually to the officer. Uninvited, a thought popped into her head. Excuse me, officer, ma'am, could you give me a lift to Merkel's? I left my pickup parked there. Do I look like a cab driver to you? Hildenpfeffer felt just a little bit bad about treating this teenager like she was a criminal. She probably was, but not convicted yet. She thought about that time that Pam had pulled her to safety after she had been gassed by some witch on a broom. She thought about the rotten mixture that she had to swallow. Okay, don't tell anyone I did this. Get in. Nancy quickly killed the overheads so that nobody would see her doing something nice. Pam had to drag Sarah from the cart and into the back seat. She closed the door and then jumped in the front. The computer on a swivel kind of took up half of the space. I really appreciate this. It's been a really long week. Nancy hit the gas to get these two delivered to the grocery store as fast as possible. What are you doing at Merkel's? Nancy hoped this wasn't going to be anything weird. You know how there's no cheese or spice anywhere in town? Do I? I had a pizza last night. Instead of cheese, they used mayonnaise. Nancy shuddered. It tasted as bad as it sounds. Pam had to close her eyes so she wouldn't see her impending doom as it came rushing at her. She kept trying to get the seatbelt tighter while at the same time trying to push on the brake pedal that wasn't there. Nancy kept talking. This whole cheese shortage is making my life terrible. The other night I had a cheeseburger with peanut butter instead of cheese. She looked over at Pam, taking her eyes off the road ahead for way too long. If this is some kind of paranormal stuff, I hope you can unscrew this mess. Nancy hit the brakes. Pam heard the sound of screeching tires and she had to look. She opened one eye and looked around. There was her pickup, parked right where she'd left it only, what, 6 hours ago? Thanks for the lift, officer. Ma'am. Pam opened the door and stepped out. The police car took off. Nancy wanted to get as far away from paranormal things and the person who seemed to be responsible for all of it. Pam was so happy to see her pickup, she nearly hugged it. She reached into her pocket to get her keys. Uh-oh. Pam patted all of her pockets in search of the keys. They were not in any of her pockets, so she looked through the window to see if just maybe they were hanging from the ignition. It was dark and she couldn't see anything was there or not. Without thinking, Pam opened the door. Must have forgotten to lock up. She looked under the dashboard, the seat. She did find that 9mm pistol that Mr. Armstrong had loaned her. She even looked in the back seat. As she was walking around, looking on the passenger side, she remembered Sarah was supposed to be with her. Oh, shoot, I left her in the police car. Pam grabbed her cell phone, intent on calling 911 and asking if she could get her companion back. Red and blue lights were coming towards her, fast. The police car slid to a halt. Officer Hildenpfeffer jumped out, walked around to the side closest to Pam, and opened the rear door. I believe this belongs to you. She indicated Sarah, who was still asleep on the back seat. Nancy gave Pam a hand, lifting Sarah out, carrying her to the pickup, and depositing her on the back seat. Find that cheese. And once more Officer Hildenpfeffer was gone. Since Merkel's was open 24 hours a day, the lights were all on. Pam could see the huge hole that Mr. Armstrong had made in the wall. I wonder where everybody is. Mr. Armstrong was looking at the door to the elevator, wondering how he was going to open it. He'd already tried beating on the door, threatening it with his pistol, and prying the door open by brute force. While he pondered his dilemma, Madame Dingus and Manuel had finished the search since the hallway only went a few dozen feet beyond the elevator. It looks like we're not going to get out of here from this end. We'll have to go back to the airport and exit through the hangar. He led his team back to where all the golf carts were either parked or piled. Mr. Armstrong's team arrived back at the golf cart pile as Hortense and her team were walking back. As she was walking, a door popped open right in front of her. It simply appeared where no door had been. Medusa came to a halt as an MIB stepped out. Figuring this nasty piece of work might know where her best friend was being held and possibly tortured, she grabbed him by the collar of his black suit jacket. His feet were about a foot off the floor. The MIB tried to fight until he was able to look over one shoulder. The look in Hortense's eyes scared him worse than anything he'd ever seen before. His eyes rolled up into his head and his body went limp. Hortense grabbed one foot and dragged the MIB over to where the others were. Mr. Armstrong was glaring at the MIB as he slowly came to. Where is Pam and Sarah? I don't know what you're talking about. The MIB tried to act tough. Dolores, do you have your waxing kit with you? Mr. Armstrong tried to give her a look. She didn't quite get it. Why would I carry a wax? Oh, yes. Oh, my waxing kit. Yeah, it's right here in my bag. Get it ready, nice and hot. We're going to forcibly remove all of the hair from this guy's armpits. Even Hortense shuddered at the thought. The MIB was worried. Then he was scared. Looking from Mr. Armstrong to Hortense to Dolores, he saw just how angry all of these people were. Uh, Wait a second. Oh, you mean that young girl and her little friend? They're at the airport. Yeah, they escaped and they ran over there just a few minutes ago. He hoped these people would believe him. Hortense stood next to Mr. Armstrong. They had moved over far enough from the MIB to have a private conversation. What do you think? Is he telling the truth? I don't know. Maybe we should go ahead and epilate his pits and see if his story changes. Mr. Armstrong gave the MIB a really nasty look. The MIB nearly passed out. If we do anything like that, it's going to stick in my mind forever. Hortense tried to not think about armpit hair. Not wanting the MIB running around giving the alarm, Mr. Armstrong handcuffed his right arm to his left ankle. He dragged the man into the room filled with MIB uniforms, leaving him in the far back corner, and then closed the door. Let's get on back to the airport and see if we can find Pam and Sarah. They all headed over to look for a golf cart that was still usable. Pam wondered where she had dropped her keys. She had already checked all of her pockets 6 times, and she'd looked under every part of her pickup. Remind me to have a second key made and stick it someplace safe. She wondered who was going to remind her. As she stood there looking at the side of the grocery store, her phone made that "you got mail" kind of sound. She looked and saw that Dolores had written, "Under Merkel's. Can you get us out? Heading back to the airport." Try that again. Under Merkel's, we can't get out. We're heading back to the airport. Mr. Armstrong and Hortense were trying to unhook the golf cart they had come in from the pile in the hallway. Manuel had rejoined the group, but he was far too tired from the long climb and the decent thing to do ah, and descent to do much of anything. Man, I'm just having tongue twisted troubles here. Mr. Armstrong and Hortense were trying to unhook the golf cart that they had come in from the pile in the hallway. Manuel had rejoined the group, but he was too tired from the long climb and descent to do much of anything. He tried to give them helpful thoughts. Despite their best efforts, the cart wouldn't come free. Looks like we're going to have to walk. It's like miles and miles to the airport. Isn't there some other way of getting out of here? Dolores felt all of her parts were aching. Either we walk to the airport or we wait here and hope the MIBs don't come before we get back. They all started walking, hoping to find a magic carpet or an electric go-kart. Dolores's phone let her know that she had a message. Pam says to wait there. I think she means here, and she'll come get us. Pam was trying to entice Sarah to follow. Come on, there's a fresh pot of coffee right inside that building. Sarah wasn't convinced. Bring me a cup. Pam looked around for some means of getting Sarah from her pickup to the grocery store. In the yard of a house across the street was a shopping cart. Pam walked over and looked. It seemed to have four wheels, and they were all straight. She pushed the cart over to the back door of her truck. Sarah was curled up in a ball. Pam grabbed her feet and pulled. The tween slid across the seat. Getting her feet on the ground, Pam hoisted Sarah up into a kind of a standing position. She leaned the tween over towards the shopping cart and began to lower her. The cart rolled away, allowing Sarah to land in the gutter. Oops! Pam looked around to see if anybody had seen her dropping the young girl. Once more, Pam got Sarah into the sitting position. She leaned down and put one shoulder into Sarah's stomach. Pam pulled, stood, and leaned back at the same time. Sarah went up, over, and then down. It was just lucky that Sarah came down in the shopping cart basket. Her head was pressed up against the mesh under the kiddie seat. Her sitting down parts were up in the air. There, that wasn't so bad. Pam had to hold the side of the cart to stay on her feet. The checker outer was still on her phone. She was talking to her BFF about how horrible it was to have to work so late at night. A customer came in through the exit. She was pushing a cart with a body in it. If you're going to return that thing, you'll have to see the manager. Pam just smiled, waved, and kept walking. Oh, well, not my job. The checker outer got back to her conversation. Pam wheeled Sarah over to the hole where the elevator should be. She parked the cart right in front of all the mess and poked Sarah. You still got that alien wand? It's in my back pocket, Sarah mumbled without stopping between words. Pam suddenly realized that she hadn't seen the wand when her and Officer Hildenpfeffer had pulled Sarah out of the back seat. Oh, no, it probably fell out in the patrol car. Dolores looked at the message from Pam. It looks like she's not coming for us after all. They've lost the alien wand. Looks like we walk, Naomi said. Belle was asleep on the lawn chair in her office. She was dreaming about buying her own island with all the money that she was going to make selling her fake cheese armor to the military. A sound woke her from her slumber. Something had crashed outside. Outside her office, not outside the building. Belle looked around her office to see if any security guards were available to go see what was making all of that noise. The total lack of security guards didn't really surprise her since there weren't any during the day or night. A spider was looking back at her. I don't suppose you'd like to go have a look? The spider just stared back. Not your problem, huh? Belle tried to ignore the sound coming from outside her door. Whatever was making all that racket was getting closer. Belle was now looking around her office for a weapon. She had the boat oar used to stir her concoctions. She had maybe a few thousand jars of potions and ingredients, but most were only explosive if mixed with the right other potions or ingredients. Belle decided the best course of action was to turn herself invisible. The bell outside Belle's door began to ring. It sounded like somebody in need of a strong spell or potion. Hold your horses, I'm coming. Belle walked over to the door and then carefully peeked out. A zombie with an armload of cheese was looking back at her. The bell rope was wrapped around his neck. Oh, no! Get away from me! What is that, cheddar? She looked longingly at the yellow cheese in the zombie's arms. The zombie managed to drop a few packages of cheese before untangling himself from the bell rope. It began wandering away towards the offices. Belle waited until the zombie was out of sight. She then reached out and grabbed the cheese packages. There were a few more over by the gym floor. Belle looked around to see if the zombie was trying to sneak up on her. It looked safe, so she sprinted out and grabbed the next couple of packages. There was one more over by the soon to be wall right next to where Mrs. Oberhair had her desk. It was still just a table, but when dealing with such an overbearing person, it could be anything she wanted it to be. Belle thought. Having 14 fresh packages of cheddar cheese, she was closer to buying that island. I wonder how much I can get for this stuff. She reached in over the wall line and grabbed the package. Another yellow package caught her eye. This one was over by those great big ovens that Mr. Bogus and Mr. Doug used to probably burn witches in. Belle carefully reached over and grabbed it. The door to the oven was open. Inside were a dozen packages of cheese. Jackpot! Belle reached inside for the treasure. Where have I read about this kind of thing before? The door slammed shut behind her. Pam turned the cart around to take Sarah back to her pickup. A bunch of MIBs were standing right behind her. It's just too bad all your friends have left. They should be well on their way to the airport as we speak, the MIB in charge said. Pam only assumed he was the MIBIC since he was doing most of the talking. Actually, he was doing all of the talking. They all looked very much the same, except when they were all standing right next to each other. The MIBIC was a bit shorter than the others. Other than that, they could have been twins, triplets, nanuplets. This got Pam to thinking about the Harknesses. Could they have been MIBs in disguise? Pam was doing a lot of this thinking thing, and she thought she was getting good at it. The MIBs accompanied Pam and Sarah to the back room of the store. None of them even offered to help push the shopping cart occupied by the tween. Pam kept an eye out, actually both eyes, for any way of escaping. So far, she had seen none. Once in the back room, they guided the two captives over to the employees' bathroom. The MIBIC pointed to the small room. In, he demanded. Oh, that's okay. I don't have to. In! He gave Pam a bit of a shove. Pam quickly grabbed Sarah from the shopping cart, not wanting to abandon her to the not so friendly clutches of her captives. She had thought about shoving the empty cart into the MIBs, incapacitating them, and then running for freedom. Once Sarah was slumped in front of her, Pam decided to look for another means of escape. Get in there, or bad things will happen to your little friend. The MIBIC gave Pam a mean look without changing the expression on his face. Pam managed to drag Sarah into the tiny, not so clean room. She was about to wonder why they were being locked in a bathroom when several MIBs all squeezed into the room with her. This reminded Pam of that time that she was crammed into a dressing room with several versions of herself. Go back and read The Bag Company Lost in Time. The MIBIC reached over and he poked at the mirror with one finger. He poked in a few places. The bathroom began to move. It felt like they were going down once more. The cab took enough time to get to the bottom for Sarah to finally recover. She sat up, looked around the cramped little room, and then she tried to act like she were still asleep. With lots of grumpy sounds, Sarah managed to get to her feet. "This is the worst dream I've ever had," she said to nobody in particular. When nobody told her it was not a dream, Sarah considered laying back down. The elevator came to a stop. The MIBIC opened the door and ushered everyone out. Not really. He walked out the door and everybody just kind of followed him. The elevator went back up for the next load. The MIBIC looked at Pam and said, "You have become so much of a troublemaker. I've decided it's time to get rid of you." "You mean you're going to let us go?" Pam knew this wasn't quite what he had in mind, but it was worth a shot. Not bothering to answer, the MIBIC led the two captives along with his cohorts along the hallway. He came to the golf cart in the middle of the floor. Pam recognized it was the one that she had been driving just a little while ago. There was a door laying on the floor. The opening led into the storeroom full of stoves. There were several golf carts piled up along the wall. She had used to stop herself and Sarah. Pam began to make a plan to somehow escape from the clutches of the MIBs and get one of the golf carts unhooked from the pile and then make a run, or rather make a drive, for the airport once more. As far as she knew, the rest of the bag team should be there by now. The MIBIC had other plans. He stopped next to an enormous oven. "We'll lock them in here," he told his fellow MIBs. The door was made from stainless steel. It was 5 feet high and 4 feet wide. It looked substantial. There was a locking device on the door. "Maybe someone will find their bodies in a few years." He unlocked the lock. As the door swung open, Belle stuck her head out from inside. She had a handful of cheddar cheese packages. She kind of smiled when she saw Pam, and then she frowned when she saw the MIBs. The reaction of the MIBs was not what Pam had expected. They all froze. Then one yelled, "It's the reptilians! They found us!" The MIBs all turned and ran. The way they were heading would take them to the airport. Mr. Armstrong made it to the top of the ramp as if it was nothing. Deep inside, he felt like giving up, but not in front of the others. Hortense stumbled from the ramp and fell over, landing on, or half in, a box full of cheese packages. Madame Dingus was being helped up the ramp by Bill and Naomi. Between the three of them, they made it. Manuel and Dolores came last, each acting as if they were helping the other. Well, that wasn't so bad. Dolores looked for some place to collapse. No one felt much like doing anything other than sitting there and waiting. The parts that didn't hurt were numb. A few bag members pulled their shoes off, hoping to relieve some of the swelling. "What do we do now?" Bill asked no one in particular. "Wait for Pam to come pick us up." Manuel couldn't decide if he should lay on the floor or drag a box over to sit on. The floor won. The sound of running feet drugged Mr. Armstrong back into consciousness. He looked at the ramp just as an MIB came running up from below. He was followed by a dozen more, all with a look of impending doom on their faces. A couple of stragglers came along behind. Two were carrying one of their guys with one foot handcuffed to his wrist. Mr. Armstrong was about to pull his pistol out and demand explanations, but the MIBs ran past him over to a door set in the far wall. Swinging the door open, they kind of fought each other, trying to get through at once. The door slammed shut, followed immediately by a high-pitched humming sound. The hangar shook as if being hit by a tornado. The door, as well as a big part of the wall, vanished. Mr. Armstrong could see the airport through the hole. "What did I just see?" he asked anybody that was still awake. Lee Bonaparte was standing by the large window in the control tower. He watched as a great big silver flying saucer rose from the hangars at the far end of the field. It shot straight up into the air, becoming nothing but a speck in seconds. He looked over his shoulders to see if anybody had seen him seeing it. Nope. He tried to pretend like he hadn't seen anything. Pam looked at Belle, who was looking back at her. "How did you get there?" "I don't know. I was at the office collecting cheese packages, and next thing I knew, I was here." She looked around the huge room. "Where is here?" Pam tried to explain where they were and what had happened. "What did that guy mean calling me a reptilian?" Belle didn't know if she should feel complimented or offended. Reptilians are a form of giant alien lizard beings. Some say they eat people, and others say that the Queen of England is one. Pam wondered how anybody could think that old lady could be a 7 foot tall creature that ate people. Somehow we need to get to the airport. Pam thought longingly about her pickup parked just outside and maybe 100 feet up. "I lost my keys, so I guess we're going to have to walk." Belle had no idea how far it might be. "How far is it? We could call one of those goober drivers." Pam was tempted. She really didn't want to have to walk all the way to the airport again. "No, there's no way to get upstairs to even call a goober driver. Sarah doesn't have her wand anymore." Belle had no idea what Pam was talking about. Sarah was looking inside the oven. "You said you were at the office just a second ago?" She gave Belle a look. "Then you wound up here?" She looked inside the oven some more. "I hope you're not thinking of getting in there. Pam was hoping somebody would come up with a reason not to try using the oven. Pam looked at Belle and then Sarah. Sarah looked at the oven and then Pam and finally at Belle. Belle looked from one to the other, wondering what they were talking about. Pam pointed to the oven. I guess we get in and see if we wind up back at the office. Belle wasn't having any of that. That's just plain crazy. It's just an oven that secretly transported you from the office to the secret underground base of those aliens. Sarah thought saying secret a lot added importance to what she was saying. Sarah and Pam managed to get Belle into the oven. Don't worry, we're not Hansel and Gretel. Then, as an afterthought, or are we? Belle tried to get back out, but she was blocked as Sarah came climbing in. Pam finally managed to get in. This is so much like that time we squeezed into that dressing room to travel through. She'd forgotten that Sarah hadn't been with her. Well, not her Sarah, but Black Jacket Pam's Sarah. The door slammed shut. Okay, how do we work this thing? You're asking me? I thought you were some kind of an expert. Belle sounded very loud since her head was inches away from Pam's ear. What did you do to make it go? Nothing. I was reaching in for a package of cheese and the door slammed shut. Sarah was almost on top of Belle. Ever since they'd been chased by zombies and nearly killed a few times out west, she had decided that the witch wasn't all that bad. I hope the door didn't lock. Pam was facing in towards the back of the oven. She tried to turn over to face the door. As she moved, the door popped open. She was looking out at the concrete slab with lines painted on it, showing where the walls would be some day. We're here, or we're there. She pulled herself out of the cramped space. Sarah and Belle managed to unwind themselves from each other and then join Pam. Now we need to run out back and get the company car. She'd forgotten that Manuel was driving the company car. Let's go upstairs and see if just maybe somebody left the keys to their vehicle here. They headed to the coffee bar to see if just maybe a set of keys might be found. No such luck. Next, they went out to the parking lot to check for keys. Naomi didn't own a vehicle yet. She was still getting used to being 20 years in the future from when she'd been pulled through that bowl of water. Madame Dingus had a land yacht, but the keys were not to be found. Bill's car was locked up tighter than Fort Knox. The solid black Volkswagen Beetle with the black interior had a set of keys in the glove box. Looks like we borrow Hortense's car. I had forgotten that Madame Dingus had taken her car to the airport, so it would not be parked at the bag office. Belle didn't drive. She'd never gotten her driver's license, thinking that she was going to learn how to use a broom. She discovered she didn't like heights, and so she used the bus, or she caught rides from people that she worked with. Sarah was still waiting to move to high school. This left only Pam to drive the car. She got into the driver's seat, and then she had to move the seat all the way forward. They pulled out of the parking lot and headed to the airport. Everything was going according to plan until they arrived at the security gate. The officer manning the gate stepped out from his guard shack. IDs and pass, please. The please was kind of an afterthought. He saw Belle sitting in the passenger seat and he began to stare. Belle used a very low voice. She said, "You don't need to see our IDs. Move along." The officer looked at Belle. "Isn't it a bit late for Halloween? And aren't you a bit old for dress up?" He grabbed his walkie talkie. I got a situation here involving a bunch of weirdos. Belle turned even greener. Pam forged ahead. We're with the bag company, and we need to go to Hangar 18 to pick up our fellow investigators. She hoped this would do the trick. The guard was having none of this. Look, little girl, take your friends and run along. Go play someplace else, like the mall. He pointed one finger in the direction of the shopping mall. Pam hated being called little girl. Mr. Armstrong did it. Wait a second. We have to pick up Mr. Armstrong. He's expecting us. The officer quickly changed his attitude. Oh, you should have said so. Go right ahead. He pushed the button that opened the gate. Pam drove through the gate and over to where Hangar 18 sat. The C-130 had been long gone. The pilots didn't want to hang around to possibly have to answer any more of Mr. Armstrong's questions. Pulling to a halt, the three women, the two women and a tween, the one young lady and one tween, walked to the open door of the hangar. Inside, they saw a few hundred zombies standing, sitting, or laying around the edges. The bag folks were all sprawled out at the ramp going down. A police car came screeching to a halt. Officer Hildenpfeffer didn't want to be anywhere near that bunch of weirdos that dealt with paranormal things. When she was turning her unit in at the station, she found a weird looking stick, or maybe it was a wand, in the back seat. She was going to just throw it away until she remembered that crazy little girl that hung out with that crazy teenager had been the last occupant of the rear of the vehicle. The stick had to belong to one of them, and it meant it was probably dangerous. Even touching it might lead to some bizarre catastrophe. Nancy had driven back to Merkel's to get one of the girls to remove the stick. The pickup was still there, but no teenager. Officer Hildenpfeffer drove over to the bag office, a place that she knew all too well, but the building looked empty. When a call came in from the airport about strange things going on at Hangar 18, she just knew the trouble was being caused by that girl. Nancy had mixed feelings towards Pam. She was the one who just may have saved her life when she had inhaled some kind of poisonous gas, but she might have been the reason the gas was there in the first place. Officer Hildenpfeffer looked into the hangar. Hundreds of zombies looked back at her. Like something out of a movie, they all began walking towards her, some with their arms extended. Nancy considered drawing her sidearm and opening fire. She figured she would run out of bullets long before running out of zombies. The smart thing to do was to get out of there. She was shifting into reverse when Pam saw the officer was about to go. Wait, there's an alien wand in your back seat. Pam walked out to the police car. The zombies were still coming, but they all seemed to ignore Pam. Officer Hildenpfeffer thought for just a second that the teen probably had no brains for them to munch on. She tried to extinguish that thought. It's all yours, but you'll have to grab it. I'm not touching anything paranormal or alien. Nancy put the car back in park. As Pam was opening the back door, all the zombies were crowding around her. As she lifted the wand, they all began reaching for it. How odd. The zombies began looking at Pam as if she held the key. But the key to what? Pam looked at the wand. Sarah, I need you. Come here, quick. Sarah had to squeeze between the legs of all these dead, undead folks. She soon discovered that many of them were in need of baths. Some must have been wearing the same clothes for weeks. She wanted to turn and run, but Pam had said she needed her, so she forged on. Sarah saw Pam's legs. She got right up close and held up her hand. Pam placed the wand in it. Not knowing what to do, but having seen a lot of movies, Sarah held the wand up over her head. A lot, a light shot out in all directions. Like a flash, as it passed over the zombies, they began to transfer back into themselves. Sam Cassavetes found himself standing at the airport, wondering who he was there to pick up. Or was he going somewhere? He looked around for Cassie, hoping that she might be able to tell him what was going on. There was much confusion as just about everybody didn't know how they'd gotten to the airport or who all these other folks might be. A few knew each other from before, but before what? Chapter 11. Monday Again. Officer Hildenpfeffer was way mad at having to stay late to help sort out all these people who couldn't remember how they'd gotten there. She didn't need the overtime pay, but found out she was going to be credited with solving a huge backlog of missing person cases. She just might get a promotion out of this. Pam got busy trying to sort out the mess until she noticed that the sun was coming up. Is it Sunday or oh shoot, I gotta get to school. She remembered her truck was still parked at the street by Merkel's. Somehow she needed to get from here to there, and then run home and change into her school uniform, and then drive to school all in a half hour. As Pam stood there not doing anything and thinking she had to do, the adrenaline that had kept her going all night without stop began to run out. All she wanted to do now was sleep. I'll just call in sick, but I'm not really sick. She considered how she could make herself sick so she could call in without having to lie. The bag folks were all running down as well. Everybody, with the exception of Sarah, who wasn't actually a bag team member, and Dolores, who had slept in the back of the company car, and Madame Dingus, who had fallen asleep any time she stood still. Okay, a lot of the bag folks had gone all night without any form of rest. They did all collapse after arriving in the hangar the last time, but that didn't really count. Pam wanted to look for Hortense since she had kind of borrowed her car. Could you run me over to my pickup? I got to get to school. You sure you shouldn't just call in sick? You look like you're at the end of your rope. Hortense didn't look all that well either. I'll be fine. I just need to get my truck. The two walked over to where Pam had parked. She looked around, trying to find Sarah. Did she even come to the airport with them? When Pam couldn't find her minion, she figured the tween must have found some place to catch a few winks. Looking inside the vehicle, Pam found her. Sarah was in the back seat, sound asleep. Belle was there as well. Seeing as Hortense drove a Volkswagen, there wasn't much room back there, and they were both snoring. Pam plopped down on the passenger seat and closed her eyes. I'll be fine. Just need my pickup. She was out cold as Hortense tried to get in. She had to readjust the seat so she could get in. She pushed the seat back as far as it would go, forcing Belle over on top of Sarah. Hortense found it a bit difficult to line up the key with the ignition. Pam dreamed about cheese and zombies. She was running through Merkel's with a shopping cart filled with spice and cheese. Prince Wapo jumped into the basket and looked at her. You're late for school, you know. He began washing one paw. Pam thought this was an odd thing for a giant cat to say, since he never talked. Well, to Pam, anyway. She opened one eye. The hangar was still there, as if they hadn't left the airport yet. Hortense was asleep behind the steering wheel. The key was in the ignition, but the engine wasn't on. Pam looked at her cell phone. Oh, shoot, it's already 9. She looked around, trying to come up with a plan. Officer Hildenpfeffer had called for a city bus to come pick up all of these people who had been missing for some days, others for nearly a month. Everyone had made an official report. The general statement went like this: I have no idea how I got here or what happened or why or when. And now it was time to get them all home. The bus took some of the missing, now found citizens back to Merkel's so they could all get their vehicles. This was why the parking lot was so full while the building was mostly empty. Pam spotted Lieutenant Mark Slot standing by the hangar door. Uh, sir, now that we know where all the cheese and the spice went, what do we do with it? The lieutenant looked around to be sure nobody was close enough to listen in. PD doesn't do paranormal or aliens. A bunch of cheese stealing aliens is about as paranormal as you can get. I suggest that you handle this as quietly as you can and leave us out of it. He looked around to be sure nobody was close enough to overhear him. You did great. I'll trust you to handle it from here. With that, he went looking for things to do not involving aliens or ghosts or monsters or anything that went bump in the night. Pam got her keys back from Bill and then woke Hortense so that she could drive them over to retrieve her pickup. They tried to drop Sarah off at home so she could explain to her mother, Sarah's mother, why her kid was out all night running around and not now in school. Sarah said no way. She wanted to stay with Pam and see how she, Pam, was going to sort out this underground mess. She also had to call her mom, Paula, and tell her that A, she was still alive, B, not in school because she had just saved the world, well, the cheese and spices of the world, and C, she, Pam that is, was now in the process of sorting out an underground warehouse full of things to make food taste better. Paula was very upset by all the things that Pam had told her until she realized that Pam had accomplished. Uh, Before you come home, could you grab some spices and some cheese? Maybe a few pounds of each. Next, Pam found her backpack stuffed under the back seat. She dug around until she found all the post-it notes Hildy had given her over the last week or so. There was peanut butter on most of them and squashed banana on the others. She needed to tidy up the backlog from the office, but first she had to talk to the manager at Merkel's. Hortense wanted to stay and help, but had a list of things to clear up as well. She dropped Pam and Sarah off at the store and then headed back to the office. The one intrepid investigator and her trusty assistant minion, went to see about the cheese. Pam walked over to the checker outer. Can I speak to the manager, please? The checker outer gave Pam a look as if to say, You're interrupting a very important text conversation. Then she pointed towards the desk that had customer service written out in nice friendly letters. There was a bell to summon someone if they weren't already standing at the counter. Sarah hit the bell. As they stood there waiting, a bus pulled into the parking lot and stopped. Pam watched as dozens of semi-conscious looking people came stumbling off. They began wandering around the parking lot. One of these people stopped next to a car and began rummaging through pockets looking for their keys. A man wearing a red apron got off the bus. He walked back and forth a few times and then he came in through the doors. He wandered around a bit, finally winding up at the counter. He looked at Sarah and then at Pam. Uh, yes? Can I help you? He looked like he needed more help than Pam could muster. The guy with the apron looked a bit, then he seemed to wake up a bit. "Oh, yes, that would be me. I own Merkel's," he smiled. "Ah, Mr. Merkel. No, my name is Jeffries." "Oh, did you buy the store from Mr. Merkel's?" "No, I just liked the name, so I called it Merkel's." He smiled some more. Pam wondered how she was going to tell Mr. Jeffries he now had a giant underground complex. "Would you come with me? There's something we need to show you." She tried her best "trust me, I don't bite" look. It took some coaxing and reassuring before Mr. Jeffries decided that he had nothing to lose. The last week or so was already nothing but fog. He followed these two girls that, for some unknown reason, looked very familiar. They walked over to the wall that was no longer there. Mr. Jeffries looked out at the street, wondering what had become of his store and who was going to pay for all this damage. Pam pointed Sarah to the general spot where the secret elevator should be. Sarah used the wand to summon the secret elevator so they could get busy finishing up this mess. Mr. Jeffries was surprised quite a bit during the next few minutes. First, he had no idea his store had an elevator or a basement. He was further surprised when he saw row upon row of cooking equipment, mostly brand new. When they led him into the room full of cheese and spices, he nearly passed out. "Who does all this belong to?" he asked. Pam said, "It belongs to you. You own the store. This is all under your property, so it stands to reason this is now yours." She hoped she was right. Pam looked through her post-it notes until she found the person who she needed to call next. Chef LaChat. You can find all the cheese that you're going to need at Merkel's. Yes, the grocery store. No, it's not beneath you to come over and do some shopping. She listened a bit more. Okay, I'll tell them you're on your way. Next on her list was Randy Cowshed, CEO and EXO of the International House of Cheese. Pam found a note that wasn't a post-it mixed in with the others. It said, "Mrs. Sandtiger, grade, spice, look into." Pam called the number. She had to explain why she wasn't in class, followed by inviting her teacher to come to Merkel's to get as much spice as she could handle, and maybe a stove or two. Miss Sandtiger said she would send a truck from the school right away. With any luck, as long as nothing else went wrong, Pam hoped that she would be graduating the next part of graduating in the lower part of the upper half of her class. Pam looked at the post-it note from Madame Dingus. The writing had changed once more. It said, "Good job. Don't let it go to your head. Things to come." I hope you enjoyed UFOs Attack the Bag Company. This was a hard one to write. Chapter 12. After all, the city couldn't decide if there was some kind of a violation involving a tunnel running under the city connecting Merkel's with the airport. When they heard the bag company was involved, they quickly sent a verbal warning to Mr. Jeffries to never tunnel under the city again. The Air Force put out a statement saying there was no such thing as loads of cheese being flown from all over the world. They also said they didn't have any all white C 130s, and there was no pilot named Captain Obvious. Someone in uniform tried saying everybody was just seeing a weather balloon, but that didn't go over with most folks. Pam discovered through her investigation skills, well, actually, Mr. Armstrong discovered through his investigative skills, and he told Pam that the MIBs had not only been stealing all the cheese in the world, they were abducting people who knew how to make cheese so they would be sure that they wouldn't make it. Oh, the cheese, that is. Pam finally made up for all the sleep that she had missed. She had a few questions for her father now that she knew kind of what he did for a living. How do you get people from place to place? Is it like a transporter, like on that TV show? She mixed in all the things that make your coffee taste like something other than coffee. Al looked at Pam. What do you mean? Pam told him about how Bell had jumped from the office to Merkel's and then that the three of them had jumped back. No, our stoves don't do that. They just jump back in time so that your meal will come cooked in seconds after you turn it on. Al figured he'd better take another look at his inventions. Mr. Jeffries had to hire Mr. Carbuncle to build an actual elevator so that he could use without having to enlist the help of a 12-year-old. Sarah had other things needed to do. The robot was programmed into cleaning up and he was put to work mopping the floor. Pam Bogus and all the bag folks will be back soon in the next misadventure. The worst thing that can happen to a young girl just before her 18th birthday. Till next time, this is Chris James for Story Time, and I hope I didn't screw up the ending too much.